Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever time it is for you, wherever you are right now. And welcome to another session of Bizarre Financing, live webinar training and support. I'm Gordon Bizarre, and today we're going to be covering some updates on Bizarre Financing Essentials. And we're also going to be going over some new case studies to kind of give you an insight as to the way Bizarre Financing is currently being used to buy some incredible businesses and create incredible wealth for the folks who use these techniques. During the course of the webinar, you may have some questions, and if you do, I'm going to ask that you type your question into the question box on the right side panel. That way, when I get to questions and answers, it'll be there. Also, you won't forget it between now and the time I start opening it up for questions. So just type it in there, and if for any reason we don't get to answer your question today, you can just put the question into an email and send it to me at gobiz@bizarrefinancing, and I'll fire back an answer to you. We want to make sure that everybody gets their questions answered. One of the biggest questions that I get from our essential members is, well, what do I do first? You know, it's like there's this wonderful world of businesses out there that are potentials to be acquired, and where do you start? And of course, we cover that a great deal in the Bizarre Financing program, but we want to cover it here too, because this is where you're starting to ask that question. How do you get started? What do you do first? Well, one of the most important things that you're going to have to do, if you haven't done it already, is to decide what business is right for you. And to do that, you start with the right mindset and the right question. And here's the question. If you knew you couldn't fail, if you knew you could not fail, what business would you seek to own? Now, the reason that that's such an important question is a lot of times people have a preconceived idea that's very limited as to what businesses they can own. They think of larger businesses, for example, as beyond their reach. They think of businesses in which they have no experience as unavailable to them. And that's not the question you should be asking. That's not an entrepreneur's question, okay? The entrepreneur's question is, what do I really want to do? What would I do if I knew I couldn't fail? And what business do I want to own? And I'm going to work out all the issues. So it's a big difference in the approach. And the reason Bizarre Financing is so important to you is because it's going to give you the know-how and the tools to work out all those issues, so that the question you need to ask is, if you knew you could not fail, what business would you seek to own? And remove from your mind any sense of limitation. Just put it out of your sight, out of your thought process. If you knew you couldn't fail, what would you go into? Now that's important. And once you figure out the answer to that, now you have both a intellectual and an emotional target to go after. And the full range of your capabilities can now start to come to bear to produce for you that thing that you really in your heart want for yourself. Really important concept there. And you want to target a business that's optimal for you, one that draws on and feeds your passion. And so then the question that you're going to want to ask is, what type of business is that? What industry is it in? How big is it? Where is it located? And do I want to start this business or do I want to buy it? Important question. We're going to address that very directly in the next few minutes, actually. And the answers that you come up with there just need to be consistent with your values, your experiences, your core competencies, and your skill sets. And all of these, except values, the values are the values you pretty much have already, but your experiences are going to change, your core competencies are going to improve, and your skill sets are going to improve. And so the business that you want really needs to be compatible, not just with where you are now, but where you're willing to apply yourself forward in these areas, so that ultimately they all are in alignment with the business that you choose. It's a growing process. Most successful people plan their work and then work their plan. The rest of us are just winging it and taking what comes along. You can wing it and take what comes along, and you might get really lucky, but the chances are pretty good that you're going to do a whole lot better by planning where you want to go. And your plan should be to buy, not start. Here's why. Small service business and simple product companies can be started from your garage, but you start by wearing all the hats. You got to form an entity, and that means you got to decide, are you going to be a proprietor? Or are you going to form an LLC, limited liability company, or corporation? And I want to tell you, you don't want to be a proprietor. That's bad. You want to be operating out of an entity that you form called an LLC or a corporation. And that's good. And the reason that this is bad is, as a proprietor, you are personally liable for any debts of your business. It means if anything bad happens, all your personal resources are at risk. Whereas if you form an LLC or a corporation, that protects you because what you have inside the company is exposed, but your personal resources and assets are protected because they're outside of the entity. So if the entity incurs debt or incurs risk, only what you have in the entity is exposed. So you definitely want to look at what kind of entity are you going to form to be in business. And that's true if you're starting. Now, what I'm going to do is, as I go through all the hats you're going to have to wear, I'm going to start listing them down here so that as I go through them, I'm going to put them here so you can clearly see what it is. But then you're going to get a sense of the scope of it as you see all the hats you're going to wear start to multiply down the screen. So the next thing you're going to have to worry about is compliance, local, state, and federal taxes and regulations. There are so many levels of taxes. There are so many levels of government authorities that you have to comply with that to start a business today, it's a major undertaking in identifying all of those agencies, all of those taxing authorities, all of those government regulators from OSHA to local ordinances. I mean, it goes on and on and on and on. And it's going to take a major amount of time just for you to wade through and make sure you've covered your bases and that you've got all these areas covered and applied for it. Because if you don't, the agency or the authority that you're not complying with literally can put you out of business. You're going to have to be concerned with your purchasing. If you're going to sell something, you got to buy something in order to sell something. You got to produce something in order to sell something. And even if it's a service business, you have things that you have to deal with in order to be able to produce the service. So purchasing, research for costs, quality, customer service, it all takes a lot of time up front just so that when you start the business and get it going, you have the stuff you need to sell and it's of the right cost, quality, and that you can then get the customer service from whoever you purchased it from to make sure that it stays deliverable to your customer. Then you got to put your sales hat on, okay? It means you got to develop your sales materials, your lead generation materials, your presentation, your follow-up. All of those things have to be put together in advance so that you can go out and sell your stuff. And then you've got to wear the hat, the sales hat, and go out and do the sales. Because in day one, if you're starting the business, chances are you're not having any employees to do all this stuff. So it's you wearing all the hats. Then once you've sold something, you got to be concerned with the customer service. So that's the next hat you got to put on and make sure that your customer's happy, feels taken care of, and feels valued. And then risk mitigation. Well, you've just plunged into this incredible world where risk is everywhere. Legal risk, economic risk. You got to mitigate all those risks, and a lot of that deals with taking care of the right legal issues and taking care and having the right insurance. All those things have to be addressed. Another hat you got to wear. Okay, then you got books and record keeping. Okay, you start to do some business. You're purchasing, you got to keep records. You're making sales, you got to keep records. You're engaging in other types of transactions that are creating the environment in which your business is going to operate. Got to keep books and records that address all of these things. You need them for taxes. You need them in order to sell the business someday. If you're going to sell it, got to have books and records. All that you have to do when you get started. Then the time comes when you're going to want to hire a first employee, and now you got this whole host of human resources. That's a new hat you got to put on. And on that hat, you've got to handle all the things that are required for hiring and firing. Where do you find these people? How do you attract them to the business? How do you decide how much to pay them? How do you set a criteria for what it is you're looking for a particular position? And then if they're not working out, you got to fire them. And then that exposes you to all kinds of rules and regulations about what you can do to fire people these days. All has to be under your hat that you have to wear when you're doing this yourself. Okay, then you've got to supervise these people that you hired. And then you've got their payroll to worry about. And that brings on a whole new set of regulations, because when you hire your first employee, all of a sudden you've got payroll taxes, you've got all kinds of rules as to how you have to engage that employee, what you have to do to supervise that employee. But all of the payroll questions come into being. And even if you hire a payroll service to handle all these complexities of payroll calculation and taxes and withholding and workers' comp and all that stuff, even if you hire somebody to do all that in the way of a payroll service, well, it's going to be very expensive, that first one, because to set you up and handle only one employee is going to be very expensive relative to the cost of that employee. So either you're going to have to do it yourself or bite that bullet of having to pay that higher cost. So all of this stuff is compounding now as you're trying to start this business. It's not a simple thing anymore. You had this great idea to go into business, but now all these things are infringing upon your ability to just go do that thing that you thought you were going into business to do. You've got to deal with the compliance for all these employees as you have them, both state, federal, obviously taxes and regulations. There are sometimes local rules. If you're in a major city like a New York, for example, you got city rules that apply to all this. You got city taxes that apply to all this. So the level of complexity starts to really hone in on you when you're starting a business. And then, of course, you got to handle the planning, the research, the strategizing, the testing of what you've produced or what you're doing to make sure that it's working right. And then reworking those things that aren't working correctly. All this to get the business up and running, and all these different hats. You got to have them all on your head, all the hats on your head, all simultaneously, all at the same time, because you're doing all these things to get the business up and running. Now, I'm not telling you this to discourage you from starting a business. People do it all the time, and they make mistakes. They wade through this stuff. Some of it works out for them. Some of it doesn't. They pay penalties when they didn't do it right, and they survive. Okay, at least to some extent, they survive. So yes, it's possible to start a business, and yes, you can do it. But I just want to give you a sense of the weight of the hats that you're going to be wearing to do it. Now, if that was the only way to go into business, was to start it from scratch, then you just have to bite the bullet and do all this stuff. But there's a much better way, and most of you know what it is. And the idea is you're going to buy it.